Welcome to Photo 2022's headline talk series Photo Live. It's great to see an in-person audience and welcome to those joining us online. I'm Anushka Fazakli, Director of Monash Gallery of Art, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we meet today, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. MJ is proud to be partnered with Photo to deliver the Photo Talk Live series. Photo 2022 International Festival of Photography is currently taking place in galleries and public spaces across Melbourne and regional Victoria, featuring 123 artists in 90 exhibitions. The whole festival responds to one theme: being human. Photo Live delves further into the contemporary human condition and addresses the social and cultural role photography plays in our lives across 8 events. We'll also explore, through these talks, how art can activate cities and public spaces. I'm thrilled to introduce our next Photo Live talk, Digital Selves. Our chair today is Alison Bennett, Associate Dean Photography, RMIT School of Art. And our guest speakers are Photo 2022 exhibiting artists Ling, Ying, and Sam Lieblich. I'd like to thank our Photo Live partners, ACME, Metro Tunnel Creative Program, as well as our education partners, RMIT, Monash University, and Photography Studies College. We hope you enjoy the event and that you can join us for our final Photo Live talk this evening at 7 p.m. So Alison, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Anushka. So good evening, everyone. As a member of staff at RMIT University, we always want to foreground the fact that we are working and living on unceded land, and I pay my respects to the leaders of Indigenous nations, past, present and emerging. I also want to thank Photo 2022. I keep getting caught up with 2020. We're still in that sort of wobbly time of coming out of the pandemic. But it's delightful to partner with you guys as an educational partner. So the prompt that Lindsay has given us is: in the age of the internet, AI and digital avatars, the boundary between human and machine and our online and IRL selves is being blurred. What does it mean for our ongoing sense of self, and how implicit is photography in this? So this is, as an artist academic who is aligned with post-human philosophy, this is a topic that's very close to my heart. But we've got 3 fabulous humans here who are working in ways that intersect with these questions. Sadly, we don't have Matthew with us tonight, and I'm disappointed because I wanted to ask him about his experience of living as a cyborg and photography as prosthesis, but we're going to talk about that anyway, I think, later on in our conversation. So to start, I want to ask each of you to very briefly introduce yourselves and your work in this festival. So I might go to Ying first. Yeah.
Sure. My name is Ying. I am traditionally a photographer and a bookmaker. So I usually work on long-form documentary projects and eventually end up in a book, an artist book of some description. I'm usually driven by, I want to say, burning questions. So the first 2 books that I made, one of them was about the Gold Coast, because anyone who's lived on the Gold Coast will know it casts a burning question in one's mind as to why it is that you're there. To be less droll, it's the crime capital and the tourist capital of Australia. The second question that I interrogated in book form, was the idea of matricence, which is the transition between womanhood and motherhood. And I wasn't sure, in the experience of it, why that entire process was so opaque and why my entire knowledge base of it was gleaned from whispers amongst other mothers with coffees in groups that the government has put us in because we all gave birth in the same week, where this knowledge base should be widely known and discussed, and something that we, are more capable of answering before we actually get to that situation. when Ling and I were asked to make a new work for the festival, the first two works that I spoke about, they were burning questions, but mostly from places of trauma. And I was really excited about asking myself a question that didn't so much come from a position of trauma, but a position of curiosity. And in the theme human, I was really curious about a part of my existence as a human that I had the least understanding of, which was this digital presence. And especially in the light of the pandemic, I felt my physicality, my place in the world, largely disappear, and my digital self really take precedence in terms of how I was projecting, how strongly I was projecting, and the relationships that I was building with other people. So Ling and I collaborated, and we were asking ourselves a lot of questions around this and responding in kind, in readings, in writing, in pictures. And this is essentially chapter 1, titled Prototype of a much larger project that we have that we hope to continue with.
And Ling?
Hi, I'm Ling Ang. My background is in documentary filmmaking. I'd like to add that I've always been a huge film buff in sci-fi, fantasy, adventure. I have been on the web since I was 11, so, circulating through all kinds of chat rooms, avatars and gaming, and, I'm very well versed with I guess the digital self. And then my documentary work, was always kind of, I really had to be in it. I always wanted to write what I knew. But then during the pandemic, being in lockdown and everything, I wanted to continue making. And that's when I started exploring 3D environments, extended reality, AR, VR, exploring that. And these are some of the elements in which we explore in 3 degrees of freedom here as well.
Thank you. I'm going to unpack some of those generational differences in your practice in a little while, but I would like to invite Sam to tell us a bit about how you come to this kind of practice and the work you've put into the festival.
I'm Sam Lieblich. I make AI-powered digital installations, essentially, for the last few years, but before that and still I'm a psychiatrist with a psychoanalytic practice, and also work in a sort of theoretical branch of neuroscience. And that's essentially how I ended up working with AI. This needs to be closer. Yeah. Because my work in neuroscience deals with a part of the brain that a lot of people, not necessarily me, but a lot of people think is the most human part of the brain, a neuron called the von Economo neuron that is really particular to human beings. And I think that there's this similar interest in locating in the body the thing that's most human, that is sort of reflected as a mirror image in artificial intelligence, or at least the myth of artificial intelligence, and attempts to sort of exteriorize and take outside of the body that which we could say is most human, something like the intellect or something like desire. And so that's what sort of drives my artistic practice, is just an attempt to represent that mirror image of my academic work, I suppose. The work I've got 2 works showing at the moment as part of the festival. One at Blindside that is engaging with the value form, really, and sort of tries to smash together a lot of concepts about politics and money. And then a much more expansive work in a solo show of Futures that is essentially a Baroque conglomeration of a number of different artificial intelligence algorithms that all show images on these 3 monoliths that are made out of steel and ABS plastic. It's actually that same ABS that you might remember from like computer equipment from the 90s. If you're ever like using the family computer and feel that, it's called a hair cell finish, I found out actually, but it's got that rough, smooth quality to it. And I really wanted to represent AI in this way as a sort of hauntological fossil, something that has always existed, even before computers existed, and also has never yet existed. in that way of being this sort of impossible object is something that's really, really central to being a human, which is, I suppose, how I end up interfacing with being human.
Wow, that's very poetic. Thank you. I'm going to maybe come back to get you to unpack this hauntological metaphor that you've brought to us. But I'm going to start out our discussion by just focusing in on the title of our show, of our talk, which is Digital Selves, which is kind of, I think if we start to unpack that, we're going to get into all sorts of interesting territory. So I thought that was a good place to start. I might call on Ling, because we started talking earlier about who we are online, and you've already indicated that in your introduction. And I made the observation that I've almost got a different personality depending on which social media platform I'm using. Who I am on Twitter is different to who I am on Instagram. Yeah? So how do you approach this title of Digital Selves? What does that mean to you?
Well, I mean, on Twitter, I'm very techie. Yep. I mean, on Instagram, I'm, comparable to any influencer on there. There's a lot of, face and skin, but I mess around with all the filters and all the glitches of the filters. And I love documenting that as well. I mean, kind of going back into MySpace, Friendster. Friendster for me was the first time I got onto a social media platform that was populated by a lot of Asians brought up in Western countries. So that allowed me to express myself from that end that I would not normally get to in, I guess, early 2000s Gold Coast, Australia. And yeah, I mean, I guess other platforms say if we're looking at open world gaming, I mean, sometimes I'm playing with genders, I'm playing with species, and seeing how that makes me feel. Sometimes it's just funny, but then sometimes it also opens up so many other things into, I guess, the subconscious. Yeah.
Yes. I was at a conference maybe 20 years ago now where someone was talking about screenshots of avatars as a form of portraiture, and half the audience went, yes, that's a really exciting idea, and the other half went, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. So one of the prompts that we've been given is this idea of the avatar, which is one way of thinking through digital self. Not Matthew's not here, Sam is here. Sam, this idea of digital self, how does that make sense to you?
There's this concept of the hyper-subject. I don't know if anybody else has heard of that, but it's something that a few of us have been talking about. In particular, I've had a dialogue with an artist, Leonardo Solas, and we have a bit different idea about what it means. But I think his concept, which is still good, really answers your question a bit better, which is that over history, different cultural products, different types of text or different types of artwork have affected the way that the human subject sees itself. So there's a point in history where the dominant form of artistic production is the epic poem, and then that's the way that the human subject sort of sees itself through the characters of the epic poem or through the procession of the entire work. And then more recently, something like the novel is operative in that way, that the subject sees itself. And then now he refers to this thing called the hyper-subject, which is essentially a subject that sees itself through the form of the feed. That is something that's fragmentary, very much captured by images or represented in these totalizing images rather than more expansive, more open-ended sort of symbolic or poetic constructions. And I think that might be the form of the digital self, or, I mean, it's a bit pessimistic, but that's one way.
And how is it pessimistic?
Well, especially when it's put into comparison with, let's say, the novel, which always has these preoccupations with moral questions and with questions of development, both external and interior. And then you have the feed, which is completely dominated by fragmentary images whose only purpose is to engage or to stimulate. That's why it seems pessimistic. I guess the aim is, if that's what's happening, that you have to find something emancipatory in the fragment. And there is, obviously, because the fragment itself can be open-ended. It's just that we're not in that part of its development, I don't think. Yeah.
When you say we're not part of its development, you mean that other people are developing those algorithms and we're not in control of that? Is that what you mean?
Well, we're captured by and persecuted by the fragmentary nature of the feed, rather than, let's say, using it to open up some emancipatory potential, some way of getting to something new. The feed, which is dominated by the algorithm, really it can only ever represent the past, and then just produce iterations of it. So I mean, I always say that the AI or an algorithm, it can predict the future as long as it looks precisely like the past, and so that doesn't sound emancipatory to me. That sounds like highly conservative, and so that's why I say there might be something in there that opens up onto a sort of broader meadow, but right now it's a very claustrophobic, reiterative feeling.
Thank you.
I have a question about that.
I've got questions too, but I wanted to ask you how you think through this concept of digital self. What does that mean to you?
Well, I feel like all of those iterations that actually Sam was talking about with the, let's say, the epic poem, the novel, the fragments, we are a storytelling species. And I think that's where we form the whole sum of our identity, what we stand for, what we represent, the sum of our lived experiences. And we're searching for ways to re-represent those stories and to re-record those stories. It's just over and over and over again, the cave drawing, and we're just finding new tools. And I'm slightly more optimistic in... I think, which is funny because actually I'm quite pessimistic when it comes to this subject matter, and this will lead on to the intergenerational thing because Ling has a lot of faith in technology. I have much less faith in technology, and we're always sort of encountering that in our work together. But, I believe that with photography and with our record of ourselves and this idea of continuously telling our story and trying to be heard and getting other people to read our stories, perhaps it's just a matter of fluency, literacy, agility, and an ability to sort of harness these technologies moving forward that will perhaps bring us to the point where we're able to be as open to ideas, as broad meadowing as the epic poem or the novel. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I guess it's adapting to the algorithm. I mean, I think it was maybe 2 years or 3 years ago when I was just testing and scroll as fast as I could, and then it's like, what would catch my eye? It'd be like block colors or skin colors. Before, you have all these kind of case study readings talking about the algorithm picking up flesh tone, and then, you test it and you put out a self-portrait, and of course it's going to get more likes because it's something recognizable, especially from your feed, but then it goes between that push and pull of, wanting to feed into that. And I mean, you see some examples of where, people are trying to share, something, with much urgency, so they put a self-portrait, and then the next couple of images is about the war that is happening in the world.
I wanted to ask you, do you find the feed fragmentary? Like, does it have that impact on you?
Definitely, definitely.
And is that something that you are uncomfortable with, or you simply embrace and move through?
I don't use the feed so much. I love Insta stories, and I think that's the documentary filmmaker in me, always kind of filming the little moments all throughout and piecing them together. But then I guess Instagram can then just naturally show that for me, let alone TikTok. I'm not on there yet, but I've approached TikTok also from the framework of a documentary filmmaker, with its editing and everything. I get 0 views, 0 likes. I don't care, but it's very nice to edit with. So.
And Ying, you had a question from Sam?
I forgot my question.
Oh.
Sorry.
Well, I want to respond to what both of you said just really quickly.
Take your time.
Sort of putting the fragmentary nature of the feed up against the narrative and thinking about where could some freedom come from. And it's more of a clinical note than an artistic one, which is that, you know, people come to psychoanalysis very often persecuted by narratives that were given to them or that they've made up based on certain clues. And so one place where there could be something that is freeing from a text that's more fragmentary would be in that, in better representing the truly fragmentary nature of life, the truly unnarrative-like nature of life, than does a narrative. That said, you can, when you impose a narrative on something, you can do something with it. So maybe bringing a bit more equivocation into that. Yeah.
I mean, I spend a lot of time with my students unpacking the foundations of how the computer, the tools they're using, actually understands an image. So we look at sort of the coding behind a JPEG, for example, and the fact that it's actually a long line of ones and zeros and how that's put together. Because I feel it's really important that they have understand the architecture of what they're dealing with and the kind of, I have this mantra which is that all technical decisions are political, all technical decisions are cultural. It's the idea that the technology is somehow neutral is a big myth, obviously. When I first met you, you said something that struck me as very sort of assertive and urgent, which was that you see people imbuing AI with agency that you don't agree with. And I wanted to talk to you a bit more about that. Do you want to revisit that point?
Yeah, you'll have to stop me at some point. Okay?
I will.
But, well, the first one I think maybe is a really good place where it overlaps with photography and with like lens-based image making or something like that, which is that, you know, debates for 100 years or so about the nature of the photograph. That is, the photographic document itself seems to represent the figure in front of the lens in some sort of transparent way. That is, you take a photo of a person and then you look at the photo and, oh, that's the person that was that was there when that document was produced. Whereas in fact, what's more accurately represented by the photograph is the figure behind the lens, the choices that went into the composition and the lighting, and then also the nature of the device itself and all of that. So I think AI is a very similar thing, and algorithmic production has a very similar quality in that one thinks, you know, that the judgments made by an algorithm have that same transparent quality. They're sort of hyper-rational and impartial and objective, whereas in fact all they do is represent the very partial, very biased decisions that went into the production of the algorithm in the first place. So that would be the first thing, I think. And then...
So you positioned the kind of narrative that we've built around AI as sort of projecting agency or selfhood that isn't there.
Yeah.
So why did you feel that that was such an important point to make when you first started speaking to me?
Well, I mean, that's the point of the work, is to deconstruct that notion.
Yes.
For political reasons. I mean,
Yes.
The thing is that if you want to look at the way that AI is sort of invoked in order to abdicate responsibility, it's invoked as an agent. So let's say in 2008, after the financial crash, Alan Greenspan's interviewed, how did we not predict this? Why did this happen? And he says, oh, well, everyone was, all the banks were using these algorithms to make investment decisions, and then the situation changed. The algorithms were programmed in a time essentially of plenty,
Yes.
at a time when there was a low-risk environment. As soon as a high-risk environment came along, the algorithms failed. And so there's these two ways that responsibility is abdicated. The first is that the initial decisions were made by algorithms, not made by people. And the second is that once it goes wrong, we can just foist responsibility onto the algorithm. And then you have, you know, like that's one particular example, but you can have some. I think that more radically, that notion of an artificial intelligence has always been there in industrial capitalism. Even from the mid-19th century, you have writers like Samuel Butler imagining a robot that's the better steward of the earth and that has no passions to disturb it. And I think that has been insisting inside of like this mythological lubricant to the running of consumptive capitalism, because there's always this notion that, well, we're eating the whole earth, but all of this activity is accruing in this figure that will exist on the other side of the horizon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the ways that I try to understand it is when you think about autopilots and on aeroplanes, there was a time when we would have called that a form of artificial intelligence, and now we just call it engineering. It's sort of become normalised in a way. But when I talk to other artists who are working with AI, there is a sense in which they talk about the work as kind of a partner or a collaborator in the project. You don't approach it in that way? You don't feel that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes playfully,
Yeah.
I feel like it's a collaborator, but it's really a reflection. And I suppose if I was to answer more, you know, earnestly, I think it's just a device like a camera.
Yep.
That is, you know, that it embodies choices made by the artist or choices made by the programmer, and that it embodies those more accurately than anything it adds. It doesn't add. Once it is deconstructed, it doesn't add something that's a surprising act of the will or something like that.
Okay.
So you couldn't say that you're collaborating with it because it's not the meeting of two desires.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to pivot slightly to another form of collaboration, which is the intergenerational collaboration that you two involved with. And we've already heard the very different relationships you have to technology. Ying, you're holding your pen like you want to respond to something that Sam just said. Is that what that was?
Maybe.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to make a note that I think, you know, the comparison between the camera and AI is interesting because at the end of the day, we're makers of content and we're storytellers. We're using all of this stuff, you know, all those choices, the composition, the colour, the choice of device to manipulate the viewer into having an experience. The way that I choose to shoot something, the kind of book that I choose to make, the size of the book, the kind of install, it's all designed. I mean, I know that there's no inherent knowledge or wisdom in the object. They're all just creative choices to manipulate the viewers
It's a
into
very
my hands at the end of the day.
Oh, it's dark.
So, intergenerational.
Yeah. And okay, so I want to give some time to talking about your work and then look at how we begin to bridge between your project and Sam's. And I'm really curious about the kind of attitudes people have to technology and digital production, and photography has become sort of diffused into ubiquitous computing. So there's this question around technology and photography is kind of inextricable in some level.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So talk to me a little bit about that discourse that you guys have and how that plays out.
So, shall I go first? Technology and photography for me are intrinsically linked. Photography as an art form different to painting or writing, you know, the pen hasn't evolved that much over that many years. Photography and the tools that we use, lens-based image making, whatever. I mean, like, is the augmented portion of our work. Photography is the deep fake portrait that we've made. Photography, you know, it's arguably not. You should answer that question. Post photography, expanded photography.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can go there.
But I think, you know, what's interesting for us is that ultimately we are approaching it from two different perspectives. So we both question the idea of the digital self. What is it? You know, that's this chapter, the prototype. That's why you have these images of a representation of Ling that's not quite a representation. It's halfway through a digital representation. The purple, the white, the imaging. You know, these are images that have been stopped halfway through the process of being resolved. We question what is the digital self, and we question it simultaneously from two different perspectives.
Yep.
So Ling is subject and questioner, and I'm observer and questioner. And we are in a continuous conversation and a continuous tension from those perspectives. And ideally, once this project is finished, we'll have an answer. But at the moment, one question begets 10 questions. So we're still in the process of like deep discussion. Pretty much every time we get together, we're having, not an argument per se, but a heated discussion as to the way that we use technology and our faith in technology is a really big thing. I'm very cynical and Ling is quite optimistic about it, I think.
So quite early on in the project, we were 3D scanning my physical form during lockdown, and I was showing my sister some of the gaming engine software that I was exploring. I was using Unreal Engine, and I always love using programs for what they're not usually meant for. So just tried to figure out how to bring in these 3D objects of my human form in, and it was really exciting to see how they would unpack it. And I guess I would use photography, my screenshots, to document the process of it, where sometimes it would unpack my form and repack it in a complete error so that my face would not be where it's meant to be. And, we love those kinds of limitations and glitches, I guess, as we're talking about, who built that form for us to use it for and what is it used for.
Yeah, and relinquishing agency to digital process, which I feel like perhaps all of us are doing to a certain extent. The more and more we live on the internet, this relinquishing of agency. We don't know where all of our stuff is going. That's been a continuous debate. Do we care? In an effort to storytell, is that more important? That's a question. So the audience?
Yeah. And we're going to call on the audience in about sort of 15 minutes or so. So please start thinking through or forming you some questions for us. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up was prosthesis, and I was really hoping to ask Matthew about his experience of prosthesis. And one of the ideas that I've sometimes think about in relation to photography is the camera as a form of prosthetic, and the image as kind of like a extended mind, like putting thought out into the world in a consolidated way, in the same way that writing is a form of extended thought out in the world. I'm not saying that it's thinking independently, but it's a way of putting ideas out. So how do you, Ying, how do you think about that idea of, when I first put that to you, you thought, yes, the camera is a form of prosthesis. How would you extend that?
I feel like the camera for me is absolutely a form of prosthesis, because what it does is as the eye captures what is in front of it, it then inverts the image, projects it to your retina, your brain then interprets what it is and finds meaning in what it is that you're looking at. Mm-hmm. The camera for me is an echo of that process. So I often photograph instinctively. I have a general subject matter that I'm working on, but I'll like to be led by my intuition. And I'll make the pictures first, and then I'll consider the pictures, and then I'll find meaning in those pictures, and I'll come to an answer to the question that I approached the subject matter with in the first place. So at the end of the day, what I come out with is visual problem solving. And that is what I believe my brain does. Does my brain do that?
Your brain, right?
So, you know, the camera for me is used in such a way.
Yep.
Same as writing.
Yep.
I organise, it's a form of organisation
Okay.
of thought and idea.
Yes.
If I could, and I would love for Matthew to be here, because I was reading a little bit about cyborgs and transhumanism, and I read that there was this wonderful prosthesis that you can get where you can feel earthquake tremors in your feet. How amazing would that be to have that sensory knowledge? I mean, I would love to be able to sense everything.
Well, could be kind of overwhelming as well.
Could be, yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
So we could switch it on and off. What about you, Ling? How did you, the way that Yin has described her relationship to the camera and to photography, how does that fit with you? How would you articulate it differently?
I think, yeah, I mean, I always had a problem with vocally articulating myself and also in writing. So visually articulating was always then my first and strong point.
Yeah.
So as I kept practicing it, and wanting to connect with different people and sharing, how I saw the world, I felt like it then built up my confidence into, for me, I can't even speak now. Into describing how I see things or how I could connect and, empathize with other people.
What are you thinking, Sam?
I'm still tickled by this notion of having a prosthesis that helps you to feel earthquake tremors, because of course feet are already very well suited to that. But I think that's like that's maybe an illustration of what I would say about human beings and prostheses, which is that we are that animal which is always prosthetic.
Yes.
That, discussions starting with Plato and more recently like with Stiegler, of the human being as always engaged in a process of hypomnesis and anamnesis. I know they're big words, but essentially hypomnesis is the way in which human capacities end up exterior, like writing or like any other form of storing memory. And anamnesis is the other thing that's happening while that's happening, which is that the human being loses it from inside as it goes outside.
Wow.
But the thing is that it was never inside in the first place. That is, the thing that we gain in the development of writing didn't come from inside, although you can sort of think of it that way only once writing exists. And it's the same for other technologies like the camera, whereas, the snapshot doesn't exist in the mind, although once photos exist, then we start having these metaphorical discussions about a mental snapshot or something like that.
Yep.
Yeah, and the same for the intellect and AI.
So I've discovered that I'm probably hyper-phantasic in that my mind is flooded with images, and I, like Ling, I used to struggle to articulate myself. Years of practice of translating the images into words enables me to do the work I do, but I have a child who is aphantasic and has no mental images and can't remember what I look like when I leave the room, and gets a surprise. They know who I am, but they can't retain that image in their head. So, I mean, there is, while some people don't have much very strong mind's eye, it is a thing that most of us do. We have images in our heads. How does that fit into what you've just described in terms of where the process of these things moving in and out of our self?
Well, you could say that the thing that we would call an image in the head can have a sort of robust description of it, and I guess I would fall back on a more Lacanian description of it. That is, the image is a sort of totalising gestalt of a concept rather than its symbolic representation. But whether or not, you know, a mental image looks like a photograph or looks like something else that could be represented on a screen, that, you know, that's, we can only ever speculate about what it was like prior to the existence of those exterior things.
Yes.
So, you know, whether the way you think is like in a series of photographs or what, I mean, that may very well be a good way of describing it now, but obviously we wouldn't have had any way of describing that 1,000 years ago.
And I certainly know that I learnt to think by my grandmother teaching me how to sew, essentially. So I get a sense of how my visual thinking was informed by that training with her. Yeah, I guess that these things are sort of inform each other. And I'm wondering how to bring Ling into this question here as well. And I know that you sort of you often saying are you a mental image person? Is that why you're more comfortable with that?
What do you mean? What do you mean?
So do you think in images more? Is that a space you're more comfortable in?
Yeah, I mean, if someone's telling me a story, I definitely visualize it straight away, and it's definitely with all the visuals from, you know, things that I have lived out or have seen.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess then seeing over 3,400 movies, it's all pieced together from that. But then I do make it a point in understanding when I am meeting people and even trying to talk to them that, you know, I play video games. You know, if they were born in the 80s, their idea of what a video game is sometimes an arcade Pac-Man. So it's like I have to understand and explain a little bit more.
So in a moment I'm going to call on the audience for questions. But before we pivot in that way, I'd like to return to your project, which is up on Flinders Lane. Yep. So there's a video work which is your face, which is shifting between two awkward, sort of unresolved moments. And then there's the beautiful installation of the still images a little bit up the road. And then you've got an AR work, which I think we saw some shots of. Can I invite you to just explain to me a little bit more about the guts of that? Because I sort of feel like I'm sensing it, and I'm seeing this beautiful shape that you've described in this body of work, but I still feel like I haven't quite understood the project properly.
So the guts of it is this cyclical nature of self-surveillance and self-optimization.
Uh-huh.
So it's this idea that with the digital self and with this convergence of the desire to storytell, the desire to be seen by the other, the desire to be understood, converging with technologies like the cell phone, the front-facing camera, social media platforms. We're watching ourselves, we're recording ourselves, we're watching each other, recording each other. And in that continuous surveillance and increasing surveillance, we're also being given tools to self-optimize and to perfect ourselves. But in the stunted nature of the technology that we have at the moment, the stories that we're able to tell, plus you have the convergence of profit-driven corporations and algorithms being used to that nature, we're really being reduced to the most superficial level of understanding who we are and where we should be and directions to optimize. And it's my concern around this is the fact that if we're self-optimizing in a certain way, and we're watching ourselves, and then so it's not really cyclical, it's sort of like this, going in a particular direction but going round and round. How is that affecting us in real life? And are we changing also, which we actually are, physically changing ourselves in order to mirror the digital self that we're continuously optimizing?
And are you referring to the way that people are actually getting surgery in order to look like the filter? Okay, yes.
I was going to say, if you manage to see the installation, if you start from the laneway in supernormal and follow the trail of imagery towards the video installation, you know, it's kind of, I mean, that in itself is the journey in towards what is the outcome. This very Instagrammable face, you know, and it's also in itself watching you, this floating head, it's surveying you. And then there's also the augmented reality part where, you know, it's my physical form that you get to control, that you get to move wherever you'd like in this very submissive pose.
Which introduces a chapter that we want to work on, which is sex and power.
I don't know. So that's the next chapter of this project.
Well, we have a few options for a next chapter, but yeah, they're different. Again, one question begets 10, and then we've, you know, so each question will have its own chapter.
I want to draw in the audience at this time. How are we doing out there? Yes.
Quick. I
Yes.
did not think that was going to come to me that quickly. I'm so sorry. Hi, thank you for all the wonderful things you said. There was a lot of thought going on in my head, so I wrote a bunch of it down. But I actually had a question. So a lot of what was being spoken about prosthesis or like artificial appendages that are, you know, not a part of, you know, your human body, that can be quite liberating for a lot of people. Like that can be like, as a disabled trans person, disembodiment and prosthesis is very liberating as an idea. But also as an immigrant, I can see why that would be like confining in kind of like a creepy way, in a very eugenic way as well, as like a brown person who's not like conventionally what is considered attractive by an Instagram algorithm. So when you're making art on an artificial appendage, what are some of the politics of liberation as well as dehumanization that you would consider?
I don't even know how to answer that question. I'm sorry, can you please simplify it?
Ling, Ling, what do you think? Have you got a response? So you've had the experience of playing with avatars.
Yes.
Does that connect with the question?
Yeah, okay, yes. Sorry, that question really went over my head. I was then like trying to think which part of the question I wanted to explore. Yeah, I mean, I guess in some of those open worlds that we do get to explore and be different species and don't get to choose some of the initial skin tones and everything, you know, I mean, then I feel like we get to be some sort of more of ourselves. It's very strange in that way. I think these are some things I'm still figuring out, you know, where I put myself into all these different platforms, exploring, and I know what makes me feel really good, and I definitely bookmark those and document it and then share that with my sister, and I guess my sister kind of narrows in on it a little bit more and, you know, looks at it on like, you know, who's accountable for this, you know, who's building this infrastructure. And then when we go into it, then we understand like, you know, the glitches behind that as well. And I say then through my own practice, trying to then build those own universes as well so that, you know, then I'd be the one accountable. So I can help represent women and women of color, but also bring in also, you know, those kinds of characters as well into those worlds too.
I mean, I think your question also contains its own answer in a way, which is that each new technology is not itself some independent virtue, so that if there's this or that prosthesis, then its use or its the way we take it unto ourselves has to be subject to some sort of political or ideological process, and then it's only after that that you can ascribe a certain value to it. So the aim of the art should be to deconstruct that which is mystifying about technology itself, rather than just let's say, thinking in a magical way about any particular technology to try to move through magical thinking, religious thinking, into some sort of scientific thinking that sees the technology as something that could be applied by a political process if that was the virtuous outcome of that process. Yeah.
I talk with my students a lot about the concept of affordances, which is there's what the technology is designed to do, but then there's also what you can do with it that actually wasn't designed to do, but you can make it do anyway. And that's the fun space in my mind. There's a hand up over there.
Hi everyone, thanks for this beautiful talk, and thanks for Photo 22 for bringing us here, and with this beautiful theme as well. I would love to know, what do you think about how technology is impacting in how human interact with other humans? Because I really don't have much hope about digitalization, and I was in some talks about how we are going to build Melbourne in the next 10 years. And it was a lot about how we can create more data and how we can make Melbourne more sustainable, more digital, and more efficient. But I didn't see like many human interaction there. It's all about how we can make all the processes more efficient, but through technology. So my question is, where is all the love and kindness in this world, and why we would want a digital city? Why we want to build Melbourne digital if we are humans? So I already asked them this question, and I did have an answer that led me in some point that I don't have hope. So maybe
What was the answer that gave you no hope?
was we need technology, because if not, technology is going to. They said if we step on side, we are going to be eaten by technology. Wow. So it was a terrible event on my mind. Like, what? But the point is, I don't know, I think we have a lack of humanity right now, and this brings us a lot of problems as on Earth, like why we have war, why we have not understanding with others, why people is having a lot of mental health issues, is depressed, anxious. So yeah, my question is, what do you think about technology? Is this technology impacting in a positive way? Because I really like your work, girls, and I was very curious about all the critical, the critical side of technology impacting our lives. Is it some hope or not?
I think it's so one thing that we've discussed often is the real life payoff to the digital world. So this idea that, okay, so we feel this need to, again, I was talking about self-surveillance, self-optimization, but what's the end game? You know, what are we trying to get at the end of the day? And then, you know, it kind of brings us into that conversation about sex and power. And it's like, well, you know, if we represent ourselves and re-represent ourselves and alter ourselves to the point where we're more desirable, more influential. So this is the idea, right? You alter yourself and you optimize yourself in order to increase influence, digital currency, and more power. At the end of the day, are you going to cash in on that? And how are you going to cash in? Is the idea to be more powerful in real life, to have more sex in real life, to have more money in real life? In which case, does that make you happier? Is that your end game? Is that what you're trying to do? You know, so I think that we just need to ask ourselves what it is that we're doing. We're going round and round and round in circles, and we're trying to advance with more and more technology, but is that serving you? at the end of the day. And I think there are many ways in which it can serve you, but I'm particularly critical about that.
I think, yeah, there still needs to be a balance. So, I mean, I owe myself to a lot of different technological platforms to connect to, you know, some people that I would say are my partners or my closest friends, but then it still needs to have that follow-up where then they're, like, say, those platforms, whether it's a film festival or an art event, then creating the environments for where we can safely all meet and gather and then in person, you know, feel comfortable. Of course, there's still some people who don't feel comfortable, you know, being social in real life, and so luckily for them, you know, the, I guess, online virtual engagement helps them, you know, but yeah, so I don't really have...
I like the first form of your question about where is the love and kindness. Well, because technology can embody love and kindness. It doesn't right now. And I guess the question is, why doesn't it? And, you know, what Ying says about the self-optimization cycle is what's there, is that it's an optimization, but an optimization for what? Right. An optimization in our interaction with the algorithm. What made the algorithm? Capitalism, the profit motive. And that's not a human thing. That's not serving love and kindness, it's serving the accrual of profits. And so how could technology serve love and kindness? You have it becomes very quickly a very radical political project, because if technology is going to be put to any good use, then the political project that makes use of it has to be good.
Can I read something?
Yeah.
It's a quote that I think speaks directly to this criticism. It's from an article called Facetune and the Internet's Endless Pursuit of Physical Perfection. And it references Infinite Jest, a book by an author called Dave Foster Wallace. This very ennui also struck the people in the world of Infinite Jest too. In the book, users of the beautiful video phone masks become so emotionally tied to the way they appear on calls that they slowly grow too anxious to interact with other people in real life. Technology then finds a way to solve this problem by all but removing the human face from the operation altogether, ironically much like the regular telephone. Wallace offers an ending to the cycle that could arguably be described as cheery. This is a quote from the book. Callers, of course, found that they were once again stresslessly invisible, unvainly make-up, and too palest and baggy-eyed, he writes, once again free. I think that that's an interesting idea.
Beautiful. I think just checking with Lindsay, one more question.
Yeah, we just got an online question.
Oh, great.
So this is from Seven. Following your conversation here, is it fair to say that AI and evolving technology are something up to grab for personal interpretation? What I mean by that is a prosthetic a tool of survival for someone, while it's a playful and experimental game for others. Either way, there's no judgment, but it is something mostly interpreted in different ways. If we're a storyteller and trying to get a message out, in which case it's a tool, and if we're someone with an illness, it's a part of survival.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's there to be put to use, and it's good or not depending on. I mean, we've got to talk about this or that particular prosthesis, but it seems self-evident that there are a lot of prostheses that are completely essential to survival, and that there are others that are sort of implanted into us, sometimes forcefully, that are maybe threatening our survival.
It's about how it's used at the end of the day. Like we were talking about technology being invented, and Facetune was just a way to change the way that we look, but it's the way that it gets taken up, used in the mainstream. Do we want to use our power for good or power for money?
I mean, so like I was saying, I have been messing around with a lot of VR, and a lot of VR, especially in Australia, is being funded by a lot of the medical industry, and that is doing some really great things for people who are still in isolation. And I mean, I get a lot of criticism when exploring the worlds of VR and AR that, it's going to create environments that will disassociate people from communities, but I guess because I'm approaching it with the idea that if there are going to be people on there that you know, and we are going to be forced into there. I hope that I can help create environments that will remind us when we step away that, you know, there's the communities outside that we can still be a part of. Yeah.
Yeah, VR really well embodies the potential problems with sort of prosthetic uses of new technologies, for instance, which is that some people are helplessly in isolation, can't get out, and so therefore, let's say, putting them into a VR environment would be very helpful. But the problem is that then it's much cheaper than, let's say, going to all of the going through the rigmarole of providing a carer or providing a way in which you could get that person out of isolation. And so VR starts as something that presents as emancipatory and then it ends up keeping people inside because the funding is drained away from other efforts to get them out of the house or something like that. And so that's why, I mean, so there's in certain ways in which it could save someone's life and other ways in which all of a sudden it's subjecting a lot of people to cost-saving measures or something like that.
I think, unfortunately, we're running out of time for this session, and but it's wonderful to get a sense of the tip of the iceberg of the richness and complexity of these questions. And I think it's really important to maintain our ambivalence, to both recognise both the risks and the opportunities. And particularly, I think what I've enjoyed about this is hearing how each three of you have very distinct takes on these questions. So that's there's not a sense that there's an intersection, but not but you each come with very particular points of view. So I think it's a really valuable thing to have unpacked tonight. Please join me in thanking Ying An, Ling An, and Sam Lieblich.
Thank you.